My name's Alex Scott. I'm the branch secretary of Together. I'll be providing today's presentation in relation to industrial update for members in the public service across Queensland. Before I start, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional custodians on the land at which we're meeting today and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. In terms of today, what we want to try and cover in relation to this process is a range of issues. The first of those is in relation to the broader wages campaign. There is a significant wages campaign which is about to be launched tomorrow in relation to the broader public sector for those agreements who are currently about to be negotiated or being negotiated within the public sector. The major issue that we're facing this year in terms of public sector bargaining is that out of the COVID pandemic, we've seen very significant economic impacts, and that has partly been seeing inflation reaching highs that we haven't seen for over 2 decades. And particularly when we have a government continuing to offer a wages policy of 2.5% and inflation hitting 6%. In Brisbane, there is no Queensland figure, but in terms of Brisbane, the Australian Bureau of Statistics does recognise inflation now at 6%. What that will mean is if we end up with a 2.5% wage outcome for public sector workers this year who are up for bargaining, they will be effectively going backwards. So in this calendar year, we will have the core public service will have got 5%, but as will of our members in health. But in terms of what it looks like moving forward, the question is going to be what that looks like in terms of whether inflation is staying high or whether it's a one-off spike. But public sector unions generally are coming together as part of a QCU campaign that will affect members in education head office in relation to transport and main roads and in relation to health head office who may be online today, where the unions broadly, rather than seeking to move the wages policy, wages outcome for members bargain by bargain, given the nature of the wage deferral process, has meant that most of our bargains are now up within a short period of time, other than child safety in the core. And that presents the workers with an opportunity to collectively campaign for a better wage outcome rather than individually campaigning. So in terms of that, in terms of people online today, that's primarily going to be our members in education, DTMR and health. This won't have a direct impact in relation to core and child safety this year, but it certainly will provide the basis for the conversation moving forward in terms of bargaining next year. So in terms of that process, there will be a kind of staged campaign. While most of our agreements are coming up in August, September, our main roads is 1 July, but our major agreements in health and education are later in the year. There are some significant agreements such as school teachers and sworn police in 1 July. This campaign effectively for Together members will be a wages campaign over the next 3 months, moving through June, July and into August, prior to our formal bargaining process in terms of the kind of bargains for schools members, education members and health members. In terms of that, there will be material going out to members in those bargains and more broadly around the QCU launch probably next week. Our members will be getting the email out of this process probably tomorrow, based on the pledges of support that we received, over 2,000 from members across the board, and very significant support for campaigning around wages. And there'll be a series of public sector report back meetings post the state budget, because clearly that's going to have an impact in relation to what the government's starting point in those discussions are, which we're expecting to be a 2.5% wages policy consistent with the previous wages policies without the sign-on bonus that we were able to achieve in the last bargaining round. That'll then move into a kind of series of, if we don't get movement in June, which we're expecting not to, we will then be looking at escalating into July, with kind of moving from workplace meetings in late June on as a budget report back process into July protest activity and looking to undertake lobbying at a political level in relation to local MPs and ministers to try and move the 2.5%. Clearly in terms of this is consistent with a broader national campaign being run in several states of Australia, and we're not quite sure what it looks like in terms of a Commonwealth campaign given the recent change of federal government, but that is going to be what we're looking at in terms of July, with the likelihood of protest meetings if we haven't got a breakthrough in late July. And then by the end of July, moving into August, having a community campaign component. So going out to the broader community and talking about why public sector workers shouldn't take a pay cut this year, with the potential for more significant rallies and potentially escalating into a larger scale rally, potentially into August, depending on some of the industrial action that may be being commenced at that point in time within schools, fire and police, whose agreements will have finalised, as well as our members in terms of doctors and transport workers. So in terms of that process, it is going to be a significant campaign. It isn't an easy campaign to win in terms of this process, because clearly in terms of the wages outcome, it will have a dramatic impact in relation to the state budget. If we are successful, it will make a big difference in terms of the government's bottom line. But given the unique opportunity we have in relation to the alignment of most of our agreements, plus in addition, the most significant increase in cost of living in terms of 20-year highs for inflation, it's something we've got to deal with. So we'll keep on reporting back to this group in terms of how that campaign's going. For those of you in transport, in health and in education, we'll be asking you to be directly involved. And for those people in the core and child safety, we may ask you to be involved, particularly as we escalate to activities in the CBD, but not so much in relation to the activities in terms of the initial couple of weeks of the campaign. But that is potentially going to be determined a lot by what happens with the state budget that's going to come down in a couple of weeks. We're certainly seeing significant media commentary already in relation to the nature of how much government is going to have to invest in the health system given the pandemic. But the primary, and the union has been focusing our lobbying efforts in relation to an investment in health, in relation to the kind of what that looks like, but not only in terms of infrastructure, but staffing. But in terms of the broader public sector, what we're also seeking to do is engage around the savings and debt plan. And it was that savings and debt plan that came out at the start of the pandemic in 2020 and has morphed a bit over the last couple of years. But particularly where that's been having a challenge for workers has been in relation to the recruitment selection processes. Originally, it was announced as a wages freeze, and a recruitment freeze in 2020 by the then Treasurer Trad. But since then, it's kind of morphed into kind of a freeze in relation to SES, and what the rules are in relation to recruitment for frontline and non-frontline, and the hoops that agencies have been struggling to jump through to get Public Service Commission approval to advertise positions is still up in the air. The original debt plan, we think, runs out on the 30th of June, and what we're trying to say to government in terms of this process is that one of the impacts of COVID has been a significant shift in the labour market for a variety of reasons. But most agencies are now struggling to get staff. Their advertising positions not getting significant number of applicants for them. So I think there is going to be a question in relation to whether or not, in what is becoming a very tight labour market, there needs to be greater ability for agencies to start advertising and recruiting more aggressively to make sure that those vacancies are filled. Because what public servants are telling us in terms of those government departments is that the impact on workload is significant. Partly we've had kind of COVID, and we're about to face a significant flu kind of breakout across Queensland, which will mean significant numbers of staff off sick. But that's been made worse in relation to workloads and the stress people are facing because of the difficulties in recruitment and selection. So we haven't got anything significant out of this yet, but what we are hoping when the budget is handed down in 3 weeks' time, or just under 3 weeks' time, that we'll be able to move, that the savings and debt plan in relation to recruitment and selection around the public service won't be extended. They will recognise the need to continue to run significant deficits to keep the sector moving, but more importantly, they'll also make sure that they don't provide impediments to public sector agencies and departments to being able to recruit to the vacancies that they're funded for. So that's kind of where we're at in terms of the broader budgetary strategy. We'll continue to lobby around that in the lead up to the 21st and see what that comes out with, and we'll provide feedback as soon as we can as to what we understand is the outcomes of the budget once we've actually seen them on budget day. In terms of other significant work that we're undertaking has been around the Coaldrake review. And in terms of that, we briefed people on that in the last public service briefing Zoom. And in terms of that process, really focusing on using the Coaldrake review for significant transformational reform in relation to public sector culture. While the stage 1 review by Coaldrake certainly was a step in the right direction in identifying the kind of issues in relation to contractors, consultants, ministerial staff, and the broader capacity for conversations and for frank conversations in the public sector. And what are the impediments for appropriate public sector? We've met with Professor Coaldrake since the last Zoom and talked him through what workers are saying, particularly around the issues around fairness and ensuring that staff are treated fairly as a significant underpinning principle to allow for an appropriate culture. So therefore, there can be appropriate advice provided to government, but also looking at the current concerns workers have in relation to the issue of recruitment and selection and the interplay between treating staff fairly or unfairly that is clearly occurring in pockets within the government, but also the risks for people's career if they feel that they can't speak out about policy items, if they think that the cards will be stacked against them in terms of future recruitment and selection processes. So as part of that, after the last Zoom we had with public servants and following the conversation we had in our meeting with Peter Coaldrake post that Zoom, what we've been seeking to do is provide public sector workers with a collective voice in this process. The ability for individual submissions is challenging in terms of the Coaldrake structure, given the lack of administrative support that he's got and the kind of his general remit. But we have been working with delegates and members across the public sector to talk through your concerns in relation to culture and seeking the endorsement of the position that kind of we got feedback from at the last Zoom about fairness and about recruitment selection. So that has been very successful, I think, in terms of the hearing we got from Professor Coaldrake at our meeting. But I think what we will be wanting to make sure is that we go back and maximise the number of people participating in that process. So as he moves from stage 1 to stage 2, that he gets a very clear message from the majority of the public sector, the majority of the public service, that the system needs fixing, that there is issues in relation to providing fundamental change around guaranteeing that staff are treated fairly and actually addressing that. Having a public sector commission that actually tells departments what to do rather than watches from the sidelines, and also to make sure that recruitment and selection is done in a way that is finding the best person for the job, but is without the manipulation that is perceived to occur in a range of agencies. So that way we can guarantee that workers are treated fairly and can speak up without the fear of victimisation through that process. And I'm confident that we were heard in that regard. I think that Professor Coaldrake has an open mind on some of this, but what we need to do is make sure that in terms of our ability to go back and say, yes, this is widely felt by the majority of public servants, we need to increase the number of people participating in our survey so we can overcome the limitations around the individual submissions and be at a place where we can say X thousand public servants have all agreed this is a problem, and that will then provide the framework to be able to say to Professor Coaldrake that there needs to be a solution rather than just relying on the Working for Queenslander survey or a range of the other issues that are indicative of the problem, but are potentially subject to internal spin around why they might not actually be relevant in terms of isolated cultural problems rather than systemic changes that we need to bring into the sector to make that real. In terms of other significant activities that are occurring across the sector at the moment is in relation to the COVID mandates. We touched on this last time. There's clearly a couple of agencies have paused their implementation of their mandates, being Cheddar and Department of Transport and Main Roads. We have had discussions centrally about this process as well. We've worked with DAF and DES in particular. We've met with them in relation to them continuing their processes and maintaining the mandates, but I think there is significant challenge around whether the government will fragment agency by agency in terms of their approach. We've already seen Fire choose not to introduce a mandate. which is putting our members at risk. I think the critical thing that is going to be significant in terms of the broader approach about the workplace health and safety framework rather than the employer mandate framework. I think the government has accepted that through our advocacy on an agency by agency basis, is in relation to 1 William Street. So 1 William Street has done a further review in relation to the mandate for staff and for visitors. They're doing that through the Workplace Health and Safety Act, and we've been able to ensure that in terms of that process, rather than employer by employer using the Public Service Act, we have meaningful discussions in relation to where 1 William Street will get to. They produced a draft revised risk assessment that is being subject to consultation with the agencies. It's being led in terms of an administrative process by the Department of Premier and Cabinet, as well as the Public Service Commission. And there's a meeting about that tomorrow with all the agencies and together to work through where that falls. So I think after tomorrow, we should be in a better position to provide clarity. I think given the nature of the 1 William Street risk assessment, I think it's likely, but I wouldn't guarantee that that mandate will be maintained. And I think we'll then be able to see where that moves beyond that. I think in terms of Cheddar and DJAG, that they are still up in the air in terms of whether the mandate is introduced or whether it's wound back. So Cheddar had agreed to a mandate but hadn't introduced it. And then DJAG, Justice had basically introduced one, but is now saying they might be thinking about winding it back. And certainly the feedback from members in Justice has been they're concerned about what that would mean for their own safety. And that's a little bit of way to go. But I think one of the challenges for agencies has been they're not quite sure what to do once that mandate is in place. So we have tried to engage centrally with the Public Service Commission, and there's a central consultative committee tomorrow to talk through what does the mandate look like in a HR sense, to try and provide certainty and clarity for all workers, irrespective of the department they work in, about what that process looks like. So I think there is good reason for that, and I think we would be wanting to then think through in terms of that process, a process around whether there should be a consistent approach to some sort of HR direction rather than relying on the underlying powers that they have, so that public sector workers are treated consistently agency by agency, rather than having it as a kind of a process of mixing and matching in relation to that process. So we'd be keen to get your views on that, whether you think that is better to have that central process or not, and certainly our ability to go to the agencies tomorrow and say that the feedback from today's meeting was X will give us a much stronger point of view. So I think broadly there seems to be reasonable, strong support for that process, and we will continue to try and work that through with the employer. The other area that we've now been working through with a number of agencies, which is related to COVID, is that a number of departments, members have come to us and said that they're concerned about the behaviour of their clients, particularly in customer service structures such as in housing. And so we've been working with members and delegates in those areas around what client aggression looks like, whether or not there has been a kind of a shift in relation to the behaviour of the public in terms of the mental health situation post-COVID, and whether that's indicating that there is a change in terms of the behaviours that we are seeing as public servants. So I think in terms of that, we are keen to get feedback from members today as to whether the nature of your agency client aggression is potentially an issue. So we can use today as a way of testing whether beyond housing and beyond some of the other customer service centres we've been working with, is there something that you think is valuable in your agency to be able to pursue to make sure that we're doing all we can to keep public servants safe. So I think what that would potentially look like in terms of a process is similar to what we're looking at from other unions in relation to other workplaces, but trying to make sure that there is the ability in this process to think through whether or not whether we think in terms of those agencies where client aggression is occurring, is it your lived experience to think that the public or your other clients are behaving differently than they were in 2019? Certainly, some agencies are telling us that, but we want, before we go more broadly to other agencies, trying to make sure that the client aggression campaign that we run is consistent with what is actually happening on the ground, and getting a real understanding of what it looks like in terms of that process. So in terms of that, I think that the results today are consistent with results elsewhere, which it is patchy. Client aggression continues to be an issue, but it's not consistent across every agency. In terms of other major activity that the union is doing, we are continuing to work with the Public Service Commission in the Public Service Act rewrite. That is still on track for potentially going to Cabinet in the near future. It won't achieve everything we want, but I think we're also hoping that we'll be able to use the Coaldrake review to influence that process, particularly around recruitment selection and about staff fair treatment. But once that has gone through the Cabinet process, clearly we'll then be wanting to engage in a campaign to talk to politicians about why the Public Service Act should be rewritten, but depending on what comes out of the Cabinet process, also seeking to use our capacity to engage with MPs to improve that legislation and or have that legislation improved in relation to the nature of the Coaldrake process. My guess at this stage in relation to the Public Service Act, I think some of the Act will be good, but I'm not sure if it's going to go far enough, particularly around conversion rights for temps and some of the mechanical issues around deemed decisions, and where an employer fails to make a decision at the moment, it's basically deemed to be a negative. I think there is an ability, we'll try and get it changed through the drafting of the bill, but if we can't get government to move on it through the Cabinet process, I think there is still going to be some capacity to come back and talk about whether or not that legislation should go further in terms of that process. And out of the kind of the conversation in relation to the wages conversation, the other issue that in terms of significance across the sector is in relation to superannuation. So we touched on that briefly last time, but we are keen to continue this conversation and work out what the union policy should be in relation to superannuation. Not so much in relation to our defined benefit members who have got quite clearly some articulated and well-defined structures in relation to their benefits, but for the majority of our members are now in the accumulation scheme. And in terms of that, the major change occurring is in relation to the superannuation guarantee levy. So in the private sector, the superannuation contribution is made just by the employer, and that's been come through a series of legislative reforms federally. But in terms of that, the big issue in relation to that reform process, is in relation to what's going to happen over the next 5 years. So the legislation itself started at 9%. It was one of those things that the various federal governments have said, yes, we should increase it, but kicked it down the road to whether or not that should be changed. In terms of what that looks like over the next 3 or 4 years is significant. So we went from 9.5% to 10% 1 July last year. Over between now and July 2025, that's going to increase. And so the private sector minimum will be, if you're working in August 2025 in a private sector position, your employer will provide you with 12% superannuation, and you'll make no contribution as a requirement. For the public sector accumulation members, the kind of arrangement we had originally prior to 2002 was 5% employer contribution and the employee contribution, and the boss put in 12.5% for a combined 17.5%. And that was a good arrangement at the time because public servants were getting a lot more than the private sector, and that was a co-contribution by us plus a contribution by the employer. That looked okay when it was 9%. Versus 12.75. But when we get to 2025, we'll be in a situation, if nothing else changes, of having employees putting in 5% and the employer putting in 12.75 and so therefore our contribution of 5% is being matched beyond the minimum of 80.75, and that is a significant shift in terms of the relative value of superannuation in the public sector. I think in terms of that, there are a range of options around what that looks like. And in terms of how we deal with government, the question I think the union and state need to start working through, and in terms of our public sector membership needs to work through, is if the employers generally are putting in more money into super, are we seeking as a union to say, as the SGC goes up, we want the employer contribution to go up. So we keep it 5%, but their 12.75% increases. And so therefore, we get to more than 18.75, which is one option. The other option, I think, is likely in terms of a conversation is going to be, do we want, is 17.75 where we want to get to? Do we want to get, if the employer contributions keep on going up, that'll mean potentially we will get to 20 or higher than 20% for our 5% contribution. Is that right for workers in terms of that situation? Or is 20%, we would prefer to actually drop our 5%. And that's not, there's a question about how much retirement benefit we want versus how much cash we want in the hand right at the moment. And in terms of that process, I think people are generally online today saying they would be keen to think that through, but would also want to work through whether this is an issue that workers care about. So in terms of the members in your workplace, particularly for the younger demographic, how much is superannuation an issue that they have strong views on? And I think in terms of today, the indication is that that there is superannuation is something public servants care about, which is consistent with the feedback we get in other forums. But I think the other thing that we would then be wanting to work through as a policy position that we haven't had a conversation with workers about and together members in terms of the public service about for a while is thinking through what our policy agenda should be. So in terms of that, what we'd be wanting to think about, well, I think clearly people are saying online today, superannuation is a significant issue. Whether you think we should also then, is this something we should talk about? Because I think the question about the 5% compulsory contribution, if we talk, I think members are going to have to work that process through, but whether you kind of, as activists and people who are regular attendees to this room, we use you as a significant group to work out what we should be going to a broader conversation around, whether you think that question about increasing the employer contribution versus reducing the employee contribution and what the target percentage for retirement should be. The element of that is saying it's always good the employer gives us more. To what extent are we comfortable saying new starters should be as a default 5% as a compulsory contribution where private sector workers aren't required to put their own money into super, and also within this there's also the ability within super for public sector workers at the moment to drop their 5% to 2%, and the employer contribution drops as well. So there is going to be some issues around that, but I think people are saying online today that there is significant support for that process in terms of talking about it. I think what we'll be wanting to work through then in terms of that is also while we're talking about the kind of trying to make sure that there is a collective voice around Coaldrake and maximising the ability of public sector workers to come through together as their union to provide that change and opportunity for change around culture. Whether we then, once that Coaldrake piece is, that process is finalised in terms of worker engagement, whether you think there would be value in going out and talking around the superannuation issue, and whether you'd be willing to participate in a process whereby we can make sure that workers' voices in relation to superannuation are heard. Because I think really the question is about is 17.5% right? Is it too high, too low? And if it then moves, what is a kind of policy question around maximising the employer contribution, but also what is something we think is a good starting point for employee contributions in the public service, because I think those things are, people will have different views on that. We've got to make sure that you have a strong voice in this process, but making sure it's union members who make the decisions in relation to that. And I think in terms of particularly, sometimes some people's eyes glaze over when you talk about superannuation, to what extent this is something that you think there would be interest and value in. And I think in terms of that, we'll be continuing to do these Zooms, and we'll continue to work with you where we can build a stronger union in your workplaces by getting people involved around the Coaldrake process, getting people involved in the superannuation conversation, but also to try and maintain a regularity in relation to having the first Wednesday of every month. For these Zooms, the notice for today went out slightly later than previously, but we have had more people online today than we had last month. So we will try and keep it to the first Monday of every month, but unfortunately in July we have school holidays. And so my view is that we will do the July meeting the week after school holidays rather than disenfranchising those people who are not at work during that period. And that way we will be able to provide you a brief feedback, hopefully, on where we've got to on Coaldrake. We may do an urgent briefing on the budget if it's terrible, but we won't probably do a briefing on the budget unless there's something significant comes out, and we'll continue to focus particularly on the wages campaign for those people, particularly in education, transport and head office health online today. And then in July, hopefully we'll be able to talk more through what's happening in relation to superannuation. And hopefully we didn't have the chat on today, given the feedback we got out of last month's Zoom, that was helpful. We will do a follow-up email today to make sure that you've got an opportunity to say how it's worked, how it's not worked, but also provide feedback about what you'd like done differently. That's really helpful for us to make these Zooms as good as possible, apart from me talking too fast as we get close to the end of the half hour. And then also making sure that you can register sooner rather than later for the next July. So if you didn't get your questions that you registered before and covered, we will be following up with a few of those after today's meeting. But thank you for everybody for your time today. Hopefully we will have covered what you had as the major issues, and certainly we'll hopefully in July be able to give you some feedback as to where we've got to, and certainly in terms of Coaldrake and the Public Service Act, we may need to talk to you about what we need to do to get the Act right. And also then particularly talking through what that strategy about superannuation might look like moving forward. So thanks everybody for your time. Sorry, we're a couple of minutes over today, but we wanted to spend time on that, and hopefully we also had more focus on a couple of issues rather than trying to jam too much into the process. And hopefully also we've got particularly would be keen on if what I've said about superannuation doesn't make sense to you, can you provide that feedback in the response to the email this afternoon, because we try and explain things in ways that work for people, technically correct, but sometimes I don't get that quite right. So if you can give us feedback about superannuation and the language we use, and whether I didn't explain it appropriately, or whether I made it too simple or too complex, is something will help in terms of developing that messaging to build the ability for workers to have a say in the future. So thanks everybody for your time today, and please dial in next month, but next month will be 1 week later, it'll be the 13th of July rather than the first week of the month, given school holidays. So in terms of that, thank you, and please stay involved. Your involvement does make a difference, and certainly the work you've done on Coaldrake has made a difference, but we need to do just a bit more to try and get us over the line in that. Thank you.